Hi, good morning everyone. Dave Cross here with you. I am circling back to video 3 of the Get MAC address application that I'm writing. And after I've moved it into the cloud, I wanted to do a couple other things with it in terms of looking up IP addresses. So now I have this script that's capable through PowerShell of parsing out logs or syslog or anything from MAC addresses, uploading it to Node-RED and returning the vendor. I now want to kind of see what the IP address is there as well. So what I did this morning, and just to show you this running here, and I don't have anything for that particular address. Let's try this one here. What I did is I added a new search and function within the PowerShell. I didn't add it to the Node-RED yet, but I'm going to move this up into the server. So as we build new APIs, we're going to do this. And what I have in this particular function is I'm now calling, after I have the MAC address return, I'm initiating an API call into IPControl, and I'm actually calling into another IPControl executive where I actually have leases maintained. And what it's doing is it's doing a call to one of the APIs we provide called getDeviceByMAC-Address, passing it a MAC address parameter on the get URL, and we can pull back the IP address that IPControl has related to that physical MAC address. And then what I'm further doing with that MAC is I'm constructing and adding those fields to the device output so that if I plan to pass this IP address into another field or into a payload or pipeline, I can do that and easily have it extract out those values and do something with it. So kind of the idea is I want to merge everything with a single object, and then I'm going to do something with that at a particular point, like format or something else. Now, what I also had to do is I wanted to put in some checks. So as you saw, perhaps in the first one, if I'm calling a MAC address and I find a MAC, but I don't have any kind of IP address information relative to it, then I'm not going to perform the search. And I've also made these parameters optional so that you're not required to enter the executive IP or the username, just simply to call the MAC address. So I'm going to break that down a little bit, go through the different script setup that I had to do this morning, and kind of show you what I have in terms of this new functionality. All right, now the first part I had to introduce into this new module, and I actually just appended it to the module. Although I already have this particular function defined in another module, I'm including it again just for the case or purposes of distribution. So one of the things that I needed to do, and kind of going back to our very first PowerShell and API call videos, is I had to introduce the GetIPC token, because now that I'm going to log into my IPControl via the APIs to query the MAC address, I need now to have the token information, the IPControl executive, and a minimum the username, keeping in mind that the file for the password is auto-created when we generate these commands to log in. So again, to look at this token, in case you're looking this on the screen and want to copy it down, we start by opening the function of getIPC token. We wrap this around our commandlet bindings, and we're entering in the parameters for the IPControl executive username and IP API port. Now, further into the process of this, we're testing out that there's a particular file that stores our encrypted strings for our password. And if it does, it's reading that information back into the command so that we can use that to call the token command, but not expose the physical string value of the password. And once we've read that in, we then are taking that password, we're unencrypting it, so converting it from a secure string back to its readable format, and then we're passing through a type, which again, we're overriding the self-signed certificate callback so that anytime we make a call to an HTTPS REST service endpoint, and we're not passing a specific certificate that matches the endpoint, we're going to override this or we're going to run into errors. So the type to do this, and one thing about types is they have to be on the left-hand side. They have to be furthest against the margin on the left when you're creating these in this fashion. It's kind of like what they call a here document or here variable in this process. The all protocols, again, we're establishing what protocols we're talking about, the endpoint manager certificate policy, and then we're really calling our URL, specifying the login URL, converting that string to a readable string and logging in. And then we're going through a try, catch, and final catch so that we can authenticate and exit the sub if it doesn't authenticate, and then also remove any kind of encrypted files if it fails during the authentication process, and or we're just printing out the login token so that we can see what's happening here. And I can remove this because I created this when I was looking at it earlier for debugging purposes. So really getting down to the point, once we have our token, just having that function available anywhere to us in the same module or elsewhere, and then taking a look back at our Get-MacVendors. And I'm going to kind of go through the areas I modified in this script. So to begin with, again, we have our function itself, and I have added an additional 2 parameters. I also marked the mac search true. So I think in this parameter, I want the mac search to be true, or I want to, throw an error because we can't do much with it. The second part is I created 2 parameters, one representing the IP executive or IP control executive, which we'll use for the IP address, and then also one for the username, both as strings, and both as non-mandatory. Because again, I want to be able to run this without IP lookup, just MAC address lookup, but selectively processing DHCP leases and so on, if they're available. In the policy and the process here, again, I'm copying the add type functionality I had in the token, and I'm actually creating the exact same syntax here for those all protocols, because again, I just duplicated this from a functionality perspective. Our headers are going to maintain the same, but what I've specifically added is a separate section that we're going to do a comparison of the executive name and the username to ensure that there's more value, that they're not just empty strings. We then are going to call that getIPC token command, passing our username and our executive. The password is going to be picked up automatically through the token function. And I'm creating a new header for this particular request because my SOAP or my Node-RED get-max function does not require that we have an authorization bearer, just the accept application. So I don't want to confuse the headers any. I want to keep them separate for the calls. So I'm going to create a new headers called new headers, and I'm going to provide the application JSON for the accept, and then also the authorization bearer using my new token, extracting the access token, which it provides, and we're going to move forward from that point. Again, just as a recollection of the process and what it's doing, is we're checking the MAC search, which is the input, and that MAC search is either going to be a variable or an individual IP as we've defined here. So one element or more than one. And we're checking to make sure that the MAC string is still valid so that we can extract the MAC adder, which replaces any of the colons and any of the hyphens within the MAC address to make that a upper string that we can look up the OUI string. OUI is in uppercase. It's also only the 6 bytes, so we extract out the MAC search from the MAC adder for the starting at 0, the first 6 bytes. And then if we see that the MAC string, search string, which it should be, but again, I'm putting in some additional checks. I had some debugging here to make sure that what we're adding into the array is a valid MAC address from this MAC search deployed. And so it's creating a string, which we're appending the double quotes around the MAC string, and then we're adding a new line, which again is the double quote, backtick in double quote, and then we're closing off this section. Lastly, we're going to join the search, and then we're going to create the body again in this function here. That's going to wrap around the join search. All right, so all of that just to bring us back to where we are today and really what those particular changes involve. So a couple of things I did differently. One is I extracted out the MAC URL and I created a separate variable for it versus having this on the actual invoke line. I found it was easier to read and also allowed me to troubleshoot this further. I would also dynamically create this since it's using something on my Node-RED. I might want to have this as part of an input or something. The results that we're pulling out of this is actually going to extract out the OUI in the MAC vendor. So either the array or string or that value. And then what I'm further going to do within this particular search is I'm going to check for the IP address. So I have the MAC IP from the search, and now I'm going to go out and perform that lookup against the IP so I can determine what is actually out in the list and what IP is assigned to the MAC address. And then what I am also further doing is wrapping this in a try catch. I don't actually want to generate an error. I just want it to pass through. But I particularly am creating a new URL, which is again pointing to a new executive in this case. And what I'm doing is doing the get device by MAC address with a MAC address conversion to lower string. And this then will go and call out any of the IP searches by MAC and return an IP. And then I am using, as part of the object manipulation of PowerShell, I'm appending these objects and properties into my IP device returned. So I'm appending the OUI and the MAC address. So again, that I can resolve this and have it look as a single object that will be able to pull all those details and pass it into the next function. So this is just kind of appending it to the top. I could have done this at the bottom, but appends it here at this particular value level. Okay, and then the output. Now we're no longer outputting the IP address. We're outputting the DevOps, which is the output is the changed in this particular function. And that's effectively it in terms of quickly getting an IP address, searching for the MAC, and then combining the two together so that you have a single object that you can pass forward. And initially, I'm going to have this running just for a single IP address, because if we're going to handle multiple arrays or arrays of MAC addresses, I'm going to have to wrap a loop around this so that for each MAC address returned with its vendor, I'm going to have to then process that, calling in the IP commands to query that for each one, and then return the results back in kind of an array. So, this first phase of this is really just, again, simply just to create this for a single IP lookup. I added it to the Mac vendors because I'm going to add this to that anyway, but I'm going to add it back to the single lookup as well. But I just wanted to show you, this is kind of a, an interesting thing of where we're going. And again, where I think that these APIs and being able to process this in more real time and or making it available to the security engineers and or network support engineers is that we can quickly determine by MAC address, what is the IP, what is the type of device, and then we can start interrogating things like routers and switches and so forth to determine where it's located, and use the discovery capabilities of IPControl to determine this as well. So when we do our cache discover or neighbor discovery, we can pull those details. And so if we're looking at a MAC address, it may be static and or dynamic. And then again, we should be able to pull that information out. Okay, so I may have to redo this again, but if this looks good, I'm going to go ahead and continue for 3. And then in part 4, I think I'll wrap the return results array into a loop of API calls into IPControl in order to make this functionality. Or, and probably video 5, I'll put all of that functionality into the server in Node-RED so that we can create an endpoint API and start to do all of this in the web and just simply have our script pass the MAC and it'll do everything else for us, in an array list. So that's it for the day. I'm sorry I wasn't around yesterday. I had a lot of documents to do. And I think I'll be kind of back on track here in the next couple of days and start focusing on this again and working through these particular examples. And again, if you have anything that you want me to cover or review, let me know and I'll go ahead and do that for you. Thanks. Everybody have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.